Thank you all for coming and making the trip in, well, not so far for you, Brian, but the trip into Paris to chat unintended consequences of emerging technology. To kick off the panel, though, I thought it would be best if the three of you just introduce yourselves and give a little bit of background as to, I suppose, what this question of unintended consequences of emerging technology means to you and why you're kind of interested in having a bit of a chat about it here this morning. We'll start with you, Brian.
All right, good morning, everybody. So my name is Brian Burg. I'm an engineer. I work for a French company here in Paris called Pixium Vision. We're a deep tech company, and we were established in 2011. What we do is we give back patients their sight who have lost it. And the way we do this is we implant a small chip behind their retina, which we then stimulate, and we can give them back vision. And what we essentially do is the incarnation of a brain-machine interface, because the eye is typically considered the first layer of the brain. And by doing what we're doing, we're pushing the frontiers of science, we're challenging the understanding of the retina and all those things. But the bottom line is the patients can see again, or at least they can read again. Now, we're a medical device company. As a medical device company, we are operating in a very regulated environment. So what this means is that everything we do, we have to go through a clinical trial. A clinical trial, you have to show two things. Basically, you have to prove that your technology is safe. So you have to anticipate anything which can go wrong. You do this through a risk analysis. And then you have to confirm that what you're doing is actually what you want to do, is your intended purpose. And for that, you need quantitative data. And this is maybe something other areas of the tech space can lean on to do their developments. However, the point I want to bring up here is that regulation comes with a cost. What we do takes you essentially over 10 years and costs you $150 million or euros, doesn't make a difference anymore. And that is a lot of money, and that raises ethical questions. To date, we have implanted 45 patients, over 45 patients, and we have a legal and ethical obligation to accompany them through the clinical study, which is 3 years. Now, what I'm going to tell you is no secret. We're a public company. Our cash runway today is less than 2 quarters. Our market capitalization is a dismal $4 million. So that poses a whole range of ethical questions. And for us, for our patients, even for our investors, that puts us into sometimes uncomfortable situations. So all those points, I think would be interesting to address here. Just a small shout out to if there's VCs in here. Obviously, we're fundraising. and maybe to conclude my opening remarks, my first thought, though, I had when reading the title of the panel was the Manhattan Project. This project where the brightest engineers and scientists were pulled together in the US to develop the atomic bomb. And when they saw what happened in Japan, quite a number of them started having second thoughts, and none the least Oppenheimer himself and Einstein. And so that made me think that this topic is nothing new. It's been around for at least 80 years, if not longer. And with that, I'll leave it.
Thank you. Megan, let's go straight to you.
Wonderful. It's fantastic to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. My name is Megan Palmer. I am the Senior Director of Public Impact at Ginkgo Bioworks, which is a leading synthetic biology company, leading efforts and our strategies around how we develop and use a powerful platform for engineering biology with care. This is a very recent new position for me. I was, for the last 20 years, though, working on various efforts and programs and with various communities around how we conceive and manage responsible innovation in largely the synthetic biology community, but also working with other communities. And the most recent position I had in that area was as the executive director of biopolicy and leadership initiatives at Stanford University. And so I've been thinking about this question of, how we conceive of the unintended consequences of technology for a long time, and probably more importantly, how do we realize the intended consequences? And also, what are the limits of our ability to anticipate and to control, in many cases, those effects and impacts. So the most significant position and the most fun I've had, I think, in this area has been for about 10 years, leading what was called the Human Practices Program within a large synthetic biology competition that in many ways gave birth to the field, called the International Genetically Engineered Machine, or iGEM competition, which is now based in Paris. And working with young scientists and engineers, as well as folks who are working in the humanities and design and art, on ways that we can, again, anticipate the impacts of our innovations and our discoveries over time. And so this is certainly a work in progress. It continues to be, and looking forward to some new friends and collaborations to think through it.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan. We're happy to have you here with us. Finally, Nolen.
Yeah, thank you, Gemma, and thank you, Hello Tomorrow, and to the people I think are over there. The lights are so bright, I just take for granted there's people over there. My name is Nolen Gertz. I'm an assistant professor of applied philosophy at the University of Twente. My work is primarily about the existential political significance of technologies in daily life. I've written books on military technology, nihilism in technology, so I'm obviously a very positive person. And I'm worried not only about the unintended consequences, but also the intended consequences of technologies. I'm reminded of the Chinese historian who was asked to reflect 200-something years later on the impact of the French Revolution, and said, too soon to tell. So again, this idea that, do we even know the consequences of any technology? What does it mean to sort of arbitrarily set a time and say, okay, it's been 5 years, 10 years, what does the internet mean, right? And again, this sort of, it's way too soon to tell. And it's I think, important to try to figure out not just how we assess technologies, but how technologies change what we think assessment means. So I'll just leave it at there. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much, all three of you, for introducing yourselves. You guys probably got my intro from the intro, but just to kind of quickly add to the three intros here. I'm Gemma, writer and researcher. I focus on science, technology, and society. My work in the past has been focused on looking at hype, the role that hype plays, narratives, promises of science and technology, not about what's terrible about hype or how to bust hype, but more how you live well with hype, what it means to responsibly hype when you live in an attention economy. And so I kind of want to jump off this idea of, a lot of the time when we have these discussions about responsibility or ethics or unintended consequences, the first question people tend to get asked are, are you an optimist or a pessimist when it comes to science and tech? And I find this question very limiting because the reality of working at different scales, you're talking, Brian, about on the ground, trying to get the work done. Megan, you're talking about managing networks, thinking about policies for large institutions, and Nolen, you're thinking about nihilism and philosophy at this completely different level. None of which is your coming to conclusion, it's good or bad. You're sort of having to sit in this, weird space of what does it mean to live in this world. And I wonder if you could reflect on perhaps how each of you manage that. Because I think that's ultimately what these conversations come to. We all know that there's good and bad and right and wrong and so on and so forth, but whatever action we take, it's more about managing and justifying to ourselves what we're doing. So I wonder if you could maybe reflect a little bit upon that in each of your day jobs and generally how you think about this work. I'm going to start with you, Megan, on this one.
How do I manage? I'm learning all the time. I feel like it's about learning to sit with discomfort and understanding that discomfort. And while I wouldn't say I'm either an optimist or pessimist when it comes to technology per se. I would say I'm an optimist when it comes to people. And I think that, feeling like people can rise to the occasion when asked, even in the midst of these uncomfortable conversations and the limits of what we can anticipate, and this dynamic of being shaped and shaping the world and our relationships through technology. I am continually drawn into biology because I do feel like it affords us this additional level of reflection through science and innovation about, what our role is in the world, right? We are living beings, and as we learn about life, we can learn about the world we want to live in. And so, that's how I manage it. That's how I approach it, and it's really with curiosity and through collaborations with people who feel like we can make a difference.
Nolen, I'm going to bring you in on this as well.
Yeah, thanks. I'm typically told that I'm a pessimist. I like to think of myself as a realist. Which how can you not be a pessimist if you're a realist? But I do think it's important, like I was hinting at earlier, the idea that I don't concern myself so much with whether technologies are good or bad, but how technologies shape what we think good and bad mean. So I think about technologies as mediating our experience to the world. So for example, this microphone right now is mediating my voice so that you can hear me, but you're not actually hearing my voice, you're hearing the microphone. But what's interesting is the idea that the way a technology like a microphone mediates experience is that it amplifies the element of, hearing a voice, but it, at the same time, forces us to sort of ignore the role the microphone itself plays in what you hear. So this idea that I want to be able to have a human face-to-face conversation, but at the same time I have to be aware of holding the microphone in a certain way. I have to be aware of the lights, the stage. So again, it's interesting about how much of our daily lives we think about technologies as helping us to achieve our goals. But really, it's about how much we have to align ourselves in order to help technologies achieve their goals.
I'm going to bring you in here, Brian, but I want to adapt the question a little bit to make it more specific to your situation and to kind of reflect a little bit on the word shaping that you used earlier on, Megan. I've been thinking a lot recently in my current research about the word pragmatic. And there's sort of two definitions of pragmatic. You've got the sort of usual definition that we use in society around being realistic and just having to get on with things. And I can imagine most people in the room here, particularly people who are working in startups, spend a lot of time having to be pragmatic about decisions that you make and thinking about the way you manage with responsibility. But in my world, in like sociology and philosophy, pragmatism has a different definition, or more academic definition, which is about I guess making the world. It's about the world being created through the things that you do. Reality is what we do. It's not the separate thing that we reflect upon. It is what we create. So when you're, operating in a startup environment and you're making decisions thinking, I'm just being pragmatic, I just need to make things happen so that I can get my funding, you're creating the reality that we live in. And so for me, I find it a very interesting question. How do we both get things done and make sure we move things forward, but also consider the fact that what we're creating, whether it's microphones or synthetic biology or brain-computer interfaces, is completely changing the reality in which we live. So, deeper question for you there, Brian, but it's still about this sitting with the trouble, shall we say.
Well, it's a very relevant and pertinent question. I would phrase it less as pragmatism, but I'm less familiar with your vocabulary. What I hear a lot and when we hire is purpose. People like to work for us because there's a purpose behind it. And when I look back to my own career, when I did my studies, in the meantime, over 20 years ago, the first thing I dove into was renewable energies, where at the beginning of the 2000s, everybody in those times, or at least in the academic environment, already saw what was coming towards us with global warming and everything. And I specialize in renewable energies. And I ended up leaving the field because I was young, impatient, and I didn't see the headway being done which needed to be done, and I basically had the urge to find my purpose, I would say, somewhere else where I could have a larger impact. And And so I would answer the question that way. What, at least the culture we have around our company and the ecosystem around it, all those people who work in there, and I like the aspect of bringing people into technology because I think that's crucially important, is these are all people who look for a purpose. They're not, obviously you have to earn a living, but they're not in it to make a killing. They really want to change something. And so this combination of people and technology is essentially important so we get to where we want to get. I think nobody can argue that technology has brought us an enormous way over the last 100 years, but there have also been unintended consequences or intended negative consequences.
Definitely. I want to make sure that the audience has lots of time to ask questions, so please make sure you're in the app, firing in your questions. Now, I'm going to be keeping my eye on Slido as we're talking. I might integrate some questions as we go instead of leaving them to the end. So if you've got anything you want to add or ask, please do it as we go, and I'll keep an eye on Slido so that we can make sure we integrate what you all want to know and what's burning questions you have as well. Let's talk a little bit about, I guess, this world of responsible innovation that we hear a lot about. We've got ethics codes, ethics boards, responsible frameworks, responsibility charters, all different kind of guidelines. And, you know, on one hand, this is great, giving people, from a pragmatic perspective, I suppose, somewhere to turn to start, you know, making things easier and incorporating into the day-to-day. But of course, there's limits as well to guidelines. You know, they can become quite technocratic. They become checkboxy, ethics washing. I wonder how each of you think about what it means to kind of create responsibility, make it, I don't want to say make it easy for people because it's about, you know, sitting in the difficulty, but what does it mean to actually start encouraging everybody in ways that make sense to be more responsible? Let's start with you, Nolen.
Thanks. Yeah, this was actually what my PhD was on, so I could spend a few hours talking about this. But it is interesting to me how often we think of responsibility in terms of purely physical causal relations. So if I knock this water off, then I'm responsible for it. But if Brian knocked it off, then I wouldn't be responsible for it, and so I wouldn't pick it up. I would just look at him and wait for him to do it. So this idea of responsibility as being held responsible as opposed to taking responsibility. And this idea that responsibility is always seen in negative terms, right? I don't want to be responsible. And this is why I'm interested, you know, we're in Paris, so I can't not talk about French existential philosophy. But the idea that freedom and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. So that in evading responsibility, I'm also evading freedom. So I'm not being human, in other words, when I don't want to be responsible. So it's interesting how much of our lives are spent avoiding responsibility while pretending that we're still being human. And I think about this in terms of responsible innovation, where again, it's sort of an evasive checkbox exercise, like you mentioned. And we all know, or at least I hope we know by now, that a checklist is not a way to do ethics. It's not a way to be responsible. It's a way to avoid it. So again, this idea of, I'm on an ethics committee at our faculty, and we have a checklist. But at the same time, we sort of, teach as many ethics classes as we can. But at the same time, we know at the end of the day, you're in the world, we are not. And this idea of seeing an ethics panel as a hurdle to get over, instead of, no, we're part of the research. We need to protect you as much as we're protecting participants. So I really wish we could rethink responsibility and focus less on the innovation aspect.
Okay. Let's bring you in, Brian.
This is a very important topic for us in the medical device world. I mean, my boss, who's the CEO, he has a personal liability to everything we do. And my feeling is, or this is how you take responsibility. He has to take the responsibility for everything we do in the clinic. Obviously, he doesn't do anything in the clinic. He's not a clinician. So you have to instill this culture, for lack of other word, in the company, how everybody on each level has to take the responsibility, and we have mechanisms to do this. It's a quality system, there's regulatory aspects you have to follow, and you put in processes, and they're heavy and everything, but that's what's written in the paper, that you have to get everybody to adhere to it and follow it and live the spirit of it, and that's what makes it difficult. And this is where, so we obviously, I'll take the example of a clinical study. Again, we have to go through ethics committees to have approvals. And this is where I assume Nolen and I could have a very interesting discussion on it, is how, yes, we see this to a certain extent as a hurdle because there's a timeline to it. It takes time to get through. You can't go quick enough and everything. But on the other side, I mean, everybody acknowledges the vital importance of taking the ethics aspect important. I mean, if we go to different field of medical devices, which are cardiac assist devices, these patients who participate in clinical trials, they're dying. They basically have no other choice at one point than to participate in a clinical trial. Now, this puts them in a very difficult situation, and ethically, this is extremely difficult. What can you subject these people to, and what can't you? And so this is around us all the time, and nonetheless, at the end of the day, we look at our planning and say, oh, we have to pass the ethics approval. It's going to take 60 days. If they have questions, it's 30 days more.
Yeah. Megan, I'm going to bring you in on this, and then we're going to go to some audience questions as well.
Well, likewise, I think I could speak for hours on this topic. And while I didn't do my graduate work on this topic, it's really what drove a lot of my work, including working in biological engineering for my PhD. And then afterwards, I actually joined in the US, the National Science Foundation. The largest public funds that they give out are in what's called engineering research centers. And I led, as part of that for 5 years, the practices or policy and practices part of this research center that needed to ask, what should we be practically doing coupled to creating really the field of synthetic biology when it comes to reflecting on how to do good in the world. And so there were many of these different frameworks and rhetorics that were applied to this: responsible innovation, anticipatory governance, sort of a lot of the inherited frameworks around ethics, legal, and societal impacts that came to this. But ultimately, many of the efforts that we drove there were under a framework of community and leadership. And it was around this question of how do we not just reflect, but how do we act in the world while reflecting on these questions that are, they're never really going to be answered. They're things that we need to work on and reflect on over time. And so what I have really been inspired by is now these communities, I would say, that are largely present within the culture of synthetic biology that are like you highlighted, really asking, how do we actually advance these things that we think are problems in the world, and then at the same time ask, are these really the problems worth solving? And is this a technical problem, right? Or is it a problem of the governance and the political institutions that surround that, and how do these play together? And so that's really what drives now a lot of my work. After leading part of that center, I returned to Stanford as a researcher, in part to join and lead a group that included folks from social psychology, anthropology, economics, and collaborators in a wide variety of areas to look critically at these questions of the ways our politics are manifest in our technologies and vice versa.
Amazing. I'm going to turn to do a couple of audience questions. We're already getting tons in, and I don't want to only leave 5 minutes at the end for them. 2 people have actually asked the same question, and someone else has voted for it. So let's ask for this question then. Can you give some examples of some of the key unintended consequences of technology that you're seeing for the future? I'm going to add to that. It doesn't have to just be unintended, because I would argue that if you're doing a good good's such a weighted word. A good, responsible innovation process, you probably will know what the consequences are, at least, or you'll have thought of them. But tell us, each of you, some of the consequences that you're thinking about at the moment and considering with respect to your work. Brian, let's start with you.
I'll go back to the very early days of Pixium when I wasn't there yet. We're on our second product now. Our first product, we put it through a clinical trial. We implanted a number of patients. And in the end, we got authorization to commercialize the product. And about 6 months later, we had to withdraw it from the market. What went wrong was essentially the reliability of the product. It broke. It broke much quicker than we expected. There was no harm done to patients, but we had an expected lifetime of 3 years, and basically we came to realize after a larger number of implantations and everything that on average the device broke after 6 months. And this is something which wasn't caught in the initial clinical trial. It was something which was in the risk analysis because we said we need a lifetime of 3 years, and it's just that we wrongly calibrated how much time we will need to see until this unintended consequence happened. So fortunately, it wasn't an unintended consequence for a patient. Nobody got harmed again. But for the company, it was very consequential because we had to withdraw the product from the market and re-embark on a new development cycle for a new product, something which we're using right now. And that's why, for example, we're extremely maybe paranoid about lifetime reliability, and we do testing in the lab, accelerated testing, where in the meantime we can show we have over 20 years of reliability. But that's just one example. I can think of multiple other ones. Again, I worked sometime in the cardiac assist device world. The very first ones which were implanted in humans, something which happened there on occasion is they had a coating on the inside of the pump. It's basically a heart pump. And the coating was put in there to facilitate the blood flow. And tests were done in the lab and everything, and it should have adhered and everything. And what they noticed in the first implantations is that this coating disintegrated and left the pump. And that was not good. And then they had to go back to the drawing board and then revise the design and everything. So from my sense, those are truly unintended consequences because we knew it was in there, we knew it could be a risk and everything, and still we thought the risk was minimal to go into humans. And in the end, humans, it's not physics, it's chemistry. There's things we don't understand, and you have to accept that things happen which you can't control in advance.
Megan, Nolen, I'm going to go to both of you, and perhaps let's shift the scale a little bit, because what's brilliant about having the two of you and having Brian is you're really looking at it at the specifics of the product and the specifics of implantation. Unintended consequences or consequence of technology, we often also talk about a much larger scale. So I'd love to hear kind of what's on your guys' minds about that. Megan.
Sure. Perhaps I'll return to the example again of this competition, the synthetic biology competition, iGEM. It now operates after 19 years in over 4 dozen countries, involving thousands of students every year that are really exploring and prototyping the uses of synthetic biology and biotechnology. They get prizes for coming up with new innovations and new tools that are added to the repository of parts that they might use for their projects. But they also are given awards for thinking creatively and with excellence about the consequences of their work. And we call that human practices. We give prizes. We judge on the competition as part of that. But through that, and I now have thousands of examples of students that have thought about what could go wrong, and more importantly, what they're going to do about it. And some very early examples of this that really show the difficulty of navigating this helping and harming axis is, for instance, you might want to use a bacteria that could precisely target a cancer, right? So we can engineer an organism that would be able to precisely target a particular form of bug and destroy it and lead to health innovations and outcomes. However, those add new tools and new vectors to interact with our bodies in ways that could get misused via the intended routes, or lead to other types of impacts because we don't fully understand biology. And so that is where we need to say, well, what can we do in the technology designs, but also how does this interface with the types of regular oversight procedures that we need to couple to it? And also, when it comes to folks that might intentionally want to use these technologies wrong, there are other types of systems that need to be coupled to it. And so at a higher level, what we think about is, if we want this technology to be broadly available and empowering and overwhelmingly biased towards constructive applications, what are all of the other things that we need to design and engineer in our societies to support that constructive use? And that's why it can't be just the technologists alone, right? We need to work with many different people who are thinking about those questions, not only in the immediate, but over the type of timescales that are involved in really shifting to a bio-based future, right? That's a big thing to contend with, but it's also very exciting.
Nolen.
Yeah, well, almost every technology, the consequences are unintended simply because you never know how anyone will relate to any product in the world. If you think about, for example, this small project between the United States government and some institutions called DARPANet, which some researchers who were involved said there was a little extra space in the packets they were sending back and forth, so they started sending messages just saying, hi, what's the weather like in California? I'm in MIT. And suddenly they invented email. So this was an unintended consequence of this project, and now this is a source of anxiety for all of us. You also think about things like, the Ring doorbell. Wouldn't it be great to be able to answer your doorbell when you're not home, because being able to get deliveries, but now we've basically made a neighborhood panopticon where you can spy on your neighbors, and this is now being used by police to find people in neighborhoods. Facebook was something designed by Mark Zuckerberg to rate women on Harvard as hot or not, and now it's toppling elections, helping genocide. And again, being used to police people based on what they're doing on their profile. So it's almost impossible to actually think of a technology that has an intended consequence. But I don't want to spend all day talking about it, but we could.
Very easily, very easily. Someone's asked the question, which was going to be my final question, but actually I'm just going to ask it now because I'm dying to hear what you all have to think about. I'm working on a project at the moment around what's called prefigurative politics, specifically with respect to the new space sector. So I'm very interested in this idea of political imagination, not just scientific and technological imagination, but and not just thinking about the future of bio, but thinking about what would be different ownership structures, political structures, you name it, this world we might emerge in. If deep tech has got these long timelines of 50 years, we might not still be living in the same kind of structural dynamics as we are right now. And companies that are operating in the space, in my mind, have quite a lot of power to shape political structures. So someone has asked here about what do you think about the need for new and more equitable ownership and finance structures such as employee ownership, steward ownership to create a better world. I'm again very interested in these. What can we do within the system that we're in that ultimately can work towards not reproducing problematic power structures? I'm going to start with you, Nolen.
Yeah, thanks. This is something I think about a lot, this idea that we love this word disruption, and this is often thought in terms of things like power dynamics of economics and finance. And yet, interestingly, what often gets disrupted doesn't actually bring those on the margins up into positions of power. It seems to actually maintain power structures. So it's interesting how much of what is seen, or at least what's marketed as radically disruptive, is incredibly conservative. And actually, once you become the power, shockingly, you pull the ladder up behind you and make sure nobody can disrupt you. I think it's incredibly telling, what's happening at Twitter right now. people having to tweet at their CEO to find out if they still have a job. I had a student recently who was, I was supervising her thesis, and she got a job at Twitter, so that disrupted her, not knowing if she was actually going to have a job or not. And this interesting idea that, more and more of our daily lives, more and more of our political lives are being occupied by technologies. So we talk increasingly about this idea of technocracy, but we don't actually see tech companies using the political power they have. So there really is no technocracy. It's really more there's just no democracy. And the tech companies that have all the political power don't want to use it. So there's just this void where no one really knows what's going on at any point in time, and we all just kind of hope it works out for the best.
That's the nihilist in you there at the end. I love it. Megan, let's come to you on the same sort of topic.
This is another topic I could speak a lot about. But I think we're really in an interesting moment, both within the U.S., where I now live, although I'm Canadian originally, and around the world, where we're really leaning into these questions of the ways our values, our politics shape the forms of technology that we develop, and how those in turn reinforce or undermine our social and political structures. And so we see these questions of, would do democracies have a particular different type of more distributed technologies, learning some of the lessons from the internet that actually empower communities, empower economic development in ways that do reinforce participation, public participation in a way that is expressed in our constitutions, frankly. And so that's a difficult question. I think it's a question that's unexamined of whether we can actually find those instances of technologies that do or don't support that type of distributed development. And likening to the political power of organizations, it's fascinating that any particular field is often dominated by sort of 5 companies globally. And there's questions about the sort of organizing power of companies versus states and how they act. And so I think these are the questions we really do need to be asking, and asking them all the way from the high levels down to these low levels of the particular choices that we make within our firms. Just one last point. One of the reasons I was drawn to work at Ginkgo Bioworks, I never thought I would work at a company, frankly, as a public servant and academic, but that they're experimenting with these questions around ownership. Ownership and control within the governance structure of a company that I think are really intriguing, and asking those very types of questions.
Yeah, so this is a perfect time to bring you in, Brian, because I think that is the point. I think sometimes when we're using words like political economy and democracy and whatnot, people who are founders of startups or whatnot are thinking, I'm just trying to get funding for the third quarter in front of me instead of the first 2, and I'm just trying to get through trials or whatever, and that, it makes sense. But at the same time, this point about reinforcing power structures, decisions made right now in the name of getting innovation done can ultimately cement. And, as the question asked, things like IP ownership, things like how much equity is given to investors, things like decisions around the governance of companies can actually have, even just an individual instances, huge amount of power, particularly in places like deep tech, because you're building technologies that are ultimately meant to have huge impact in the future. So I wonder if and how you think about this, considering your day-to-day stresses of running a startup.
For us, it's an everyday topic, and it brings me back to what I said in my opening statement. I mean, we're in an over 10-year journey, 150 million. Now, nobody will sit down and give you 150 million and say, come back in 12 years and show you what you've got. It just doesn't work like that. So we're in this constant cat race to a certain extent to do fundraising. On the other side, you've got the investors who want their return on investment. And And the big difficulties, I think everybody who's in a startup here can relate to that, is with your investors, is when do they want their return on investment? And basically, the longest term you can find today, not that I'm a true expert in it, but if you go to the healthcare funds and stuff like that, you're, I don't know, I'm going to say 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And here I am telling you it takes 10 years plus. Nobody wants to hear that. If you take other more... let's go back to the energy area, groundbreaking technology, large infrastructure products and everything. Yes, I agree, 50-year projects is a reality. Today, our democracies are not necessarily set up to think, well, set up, I don't know, but to think that long term, you think an election cycle, maybe generation, 25 years, but nobody has a mindset for 50 years today. I would even question, is it human to be able to think that far? And I'll close these remarks by made me remember something when I was studying, again, over 20 years ago, and we were looking at the charts of how much oil is available, and in those days there was 40 years of oil available, and the comment our professor made was, you know, oil's been available for 40 years since 40 years. Why is that? It's because the oil companies are the companies who think the longest in advance, and their horizon reaches a maximum of 40 years. No other company in the world thinks longer than 40 years in advance. So that blows your 50-year time frame. And that, frankly, that's going to be a societal challenge, where everybody needs to be involved, and from the bottom all the way to the top. And we're just beginning to scratch the surface on that, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's important to be able to, even if we don't have the answers, start prodding these kind of questions. I mean, even using language like from lab to market, we're reinforcing the idea of a market and reinforcing the idea of trade and so on and so forth. And I think making small changes and thinking about things like, as the person asked, ownership and control is one way of just perhaps starting to make some shifts that don't mean we live in a world where 40 years is the longest we can think. Why can't we build something that's longer? Why can't we have money that flows for longer? Do we even need money? All these kind of questions. I want to turn to another question from the audience. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I'm conscious I don't think we've mentioned sustainability and climate yet in our discussion, which of course is one of the biggest topics nowadays, and we will continue into this. The next section's on energy. But someone's asked, is innovation truly sustainable? How can we continue to progress but not run into some new resource limit or ethical issues? How can we be content with what we have? It's a nice question. I'm gonna go to you, Nolen, on that. I think it's a nice philosophical one to start off with.
Yeah, that's a good question. I spent a lot of time thinking about the environment and climate nihilism. And this idea that, again, if tech solutionism is reigning supreme anywhere, it's probably in debates about climate change. Where I was at a festival like this recently in London, and another panelist said, "Oh, we don't have to worry about climate change. The tech companies will figure it out." And it's just, again, this sort of, if the major CEOs are building their own space programs to get off Earth, I don't think that's a good sign that they're about to solve it. So again, this idea that, we talk a lot about sustainability, and Gemma mentioned ethics washing. There's also now greenwashing. So this idea that in the same way that with smartwatches, we all start talking about fitness, but we don't actually know what fitness means, other than this nebulous idea of if you reach your step counter. Something similar with sustainability, where we just have this sort of idea that you can buy carbon reduction, and then you find out that companies like Tesla, that this is one of the main ways they actually make money, is not selling cars, but actually being this carbon offset marketplace. So this interesting idea that there are actually, because of carbon offsets, companies are allowed to be even polluting more than before, because we've created this weird sort of game where we can pretend we care about sustainability, because we just pay under the table to get rid of it. So yeah, I'm incredibly worried when we do talk about things like 40, 50 years in the future. We don't know if we have 4 or 5 years in the future. So again, where are our priorities, and how are we getting distracted?
I know you want to say something, Megan, but we've only got 2 minutes left, and you can incorporate it into your next answer, perhaps. What I want to do to end on, because I'm conscious we're here at Hello Tomorrow, we've got some amazing stuff coming up, we've got amazing people in the audience. I know I said at the beginning it's not about optimism and pessimism, but I would love to end on a note on, we've had a deep discussion. What can people take from this? How can we either take it into the rest of the conference and beyond, or even just have a little ponder over lunch about some of these issues? What would be your advice to continue this thought and conversation? Brian, I'm going to start with you.
Find a purpose to what you do.
Okay, love it. Short and sweet, we love it. Megan, I'll come to you.
I think similarly, I don't think these questions need to lead to paralysis. I think they can lead to activation. Even in the question of sustainability, I co-chair a World Economic Forum Global Future Council in synthetic biology, and we wrote a report that looked through the lenses of equity, humility, solidarity, and sustainability over the last 20 years, and looking forward. And that included folks from, who are entrepreneurs, who are investors, who are scientists, who are working in civil society, and used that to really drive an agenda for what we do next. And I would love to see it from this community as well, to reflect and use that to drive new directions.
Yeah, I think given where we are, I would say read Simone de Beauvoir and her idea that morality resides in the pain of an indefinite questioning.
Oh, say that again. Morality resides
in the pain of indefinite questioning. So
love it.
If you're asking questions, that's already a good step.
Amazing. And I'm going to add one final thing, because another topic that we haven't spoken about, which normally comes up quite a lot in innovation discussions, which we have not a time to cover. Just want to acknowledge we are all white on this panel. Inclusivity, diversity is obviously really important, and I think reflection on that is also extremely important, particularly in these kind of spaces, being aware of the types of people that are normally have more power in our worlds. But hopefully you can take some of these seeds of thought, some perhaps things that have challenged you, made you feel a little bit uncomfortable, but hopefully optimistic and G'd up and thinking that responsibility is a form of freedom and excitement and something to work towards as opposed to something to shy away from as we move forward and enjoy the rest of Hello Tomorrow. Please, everyone in the audience, please join me in thanking my amazing panelists, Nolen, Megan, and Brian.